Peter, welcome to the Gnostic Media Podcast.
Well, Jan, thanks for having me. Looking forward to this.
It was Jason Martineau who I had on a couple of months ago with his presentation on the spiritual dimensions of music, and he had mentioned you after the show to present the Enneagram, so I followed up with that, and it certainly looks like you've got some fascinating information to provide us. So first off, why don't you tell us what is the Enneagram?
Well, the Enneagram is a 9-pointed diagram, and it's been used in centuries past for a number of things. How we use it today is we use it to organize a system of personality types. And all these personality types are known in modern psychology, but the Enneagram is a great organizing framework for all kinds of information, in this case, personality types.
And for people who have never heard of the Enneagram, how would you typically describe it?
Well, we'd say that it's a system of 9 personality types, and that each of these personality types has a particular point of view, a way of seeing the world, and a relational style. And so what we have here is an organized system. So each of the 9 types, if people can identify their personality type with the Enneagram, they get a lot of great information about themselves and also about the other people in their lives. So it's been found to be a very useful tool for self-development, for self-awareness, for relationships at home and at work, and for a number of different kinds of applications.
And how did you initially come across the Enneagram?
I was a young holistic counselor in Berkeley, California in the 1970s, and specifically I'd come out to really learn more about body therapy and holistic health. I was a counselor in Maryland at the time. And so I was out in Berkeley, and in 1978, the first public class in the Enneagram system happened, and we were there on the scene, so to speak. And it just dropped like a kind of a bombshell into our community at the time. And I've been working with it ever since. We had no idea at the time that it would become such a successful system around the world. You know, we thought it was just one of these Berkeley things, but then again, Berkeley's known for exporting some very good ideas, and I think the Enneagram is one of them. But, you know, it had this kind of strange name, and it's got a funny-looking diagram, and my first reaction was, oh, this is one of those California things, and, you know, a bit too California for me, even though I'm a Californian. Actually, it turned out to be something very sophisticated with a lot of staying power.
Okay, Peter, tell us a little bit about about yourself and your background. What is your background?
I've been working for 35 plus years as a counselor and a body therapist, and I've been involved in community mental health centers and nonprofit organizations, both on the East Coast and here in California. And so for many years, you know, I've had the advantage of both working with people in my private practice and in my groups, and being able to use this Enneagram system as part of that. It's been just a marvelous help to me. So, and gradually I've been drawn more and more into teaching the Enneagram, both in the United States and in other countries around the world. But I still, again, my background is as a counselor, holistic health counselor, and as a body therapist.
And how did you get into this work?
Well, I originally was in college on the East Coast and dropped out of college and dropped into community mental health, so to speak. And back in the days of the 70s when people were, there was a lot of idealism about what was possible for communities. Many of us participated in creating community-based programs for mental health. And when I came to California, I did the same thing. Actually, we had a center in Berkeley for a number of years. We actually had a big dance studio, which we turned into a center, holistic center. And again, being in Berkeley during the 70s, we were exposed to a lot of interesting new systems and ideas and methodologies, some of which turned out to be pretty flaky and didn't last. But again, the Enneagram took hold, planted some roots there, and is, of course, spread around the world to many countries. This is about now 32 years I've been working with the system. And one of the things I like about the Enneagram is that it has a lot of different applications. It started out in this community of transpersonal psychology people who are interested in the integration of psychology and spirituality. And we still use it for that purpose because it's the same obstacles to our psychological development are the same obstacles to our spiritual development. But since that time, the Enneagram has really expanded into a number of different places that have been a little surprising, but it makes sense because, it just helps people reduce unnecessary conflict, to communicate better, to build bridges, to be able to cooperate. So it's now used in a lot of organizations, some big corporations in different places, for the purposes of team building and leadership development and conflict management. So that's one of the things I appreciate about working with this is that I still love my practice, my counseling practice, and my body therapy practice, but the Enneagram has gotten me out to meet with people in a lot of different places, people in education, people in religious congregations, people in corporations and nonprofits who are all interested in being able to work with developing their own self-awareness, to be better communicators, and to really to build bridges with others. And the Enneagram does that.
Who are your important teachers?
When we were young in Berkeley, we had a teacher, Helen Palmer, who was a trusted advisor, a teacher of meditation, a teacher of intuition. And Helen called our house one day. Of course, it was more of the women who were interested in studying intuition with her, but I like to say I was connected to the right women. And she said, well, there's this class happening in Berkeley, you should go. And this class turned out to be the first public class taught on the Enneagram by Dr. Kathleen Spieth, who became my teacher and mentor for a number of years. And also I continued to work with Helen Palmer, who's also emerged as one of the main Enneagram authors and Enneagram teachers in the world. So, like I say, I was fortunate to be in the right place at the right time and to get it fairly young. And so I had the benefit of working with Kathleen Spieth, who often is known to people from her little book called The Gurdjieff Work, which is a great short book on Gurdjieff, and Helen Palmer. And I have to say that the person who really started all this was Dr. Claudio Naranjo, who was a well-known Gestalt therapist, a psychiatrist, and a pretty well-known guy, an author. And he had gone to a place called Arica, Chile, to work with another guy named Oscar Ichazo, who was a mystic and a teacher of human development. And Ichazo was the man who really arranged the personality types in a very basic way around the symbol of the Enneagram. The Enneagram symbol has a long history. Maybe we can get into that in a bit. But Claudio, who had gone to study with Oscar Ichazo, came back to California and put this basic template of types, brought it together with modern psychology, because as a psychologist he could point to all of the character structures, the personality types in the psychological literature. And so now we have this, what we say is we've got a system that combines traditional wisdom from centuries past, but also integrates modern psychology. A lot of what we talk about with the Enneagram is not unique to the Enneagram. Again, all the types are found in the psychological literature, but what the Enneagram does is it doesn't just describe people in terms of their neurosis or their symptoms, but gives a more balanced view of both our strengths, what we're good at, and also some of the problems and challenges we face.
All right, so let's go into some of these images that you provided. And actually, I forgot to mention this is going to be an interactive interview, isn't it?
Yeah, we've got some fun slides to look at.
All right, and let's pull up slide 2, and it's number and cosmology.
Yeah, I wanted to start with talking to you and, your website, gnosticmedia.com. I wanted to try to place the Enneagram in a Gnostic tradition. And it's not that I'm an expert on this, but my understanding is that there is a strong relationship here between the Enneagram symbol and many of the traditions of inner knowledge. people questing for inner knowledge. So just decided to start with this slide called Number and Cosmology, and looking at how people have used numbers as these archetypal structures to inform us in terms of both nature and human consciousness. So the Enneagram is in this tradition as being a number set. But most simply, it's a number set. It's a 9-pointed diagram. And we're pretty sure it was known to the early Greek mathematicians, and then it shows up much later in European history.
What about slide 3, early mathematicians?
We like to consider the Enneagram as deriving from the number 3. The 3 is the basic number. 3, kind of puts things into motion. And so there's some intelligence here in the symbol itself. So, just harking back to Pythagoras and also Plato as people who used numbers to begin to describe how the universe was organized and, what we might call universal laws.
And number 4?
All right, just a simple reference to Plato here. Again, Jason Martineau, my good friend who was on your show recently talking about music, knows a lot more about sacred geometry than I do. But we'll go to slide number 5 here. And here's the basic triangle, the number 3 represented by the triangle. And, of course, the Trinity there's a lot of things to say about the number 3 and the Trinity. One thing we could say is that it's found in a lot of the great religious traditions, both in Christianity and also in Hinduism. If we go to slide 6, we can see this progression from 3 to 6 to 9. And there are different qualities to these figures. They all signify something a little bit different. But what we end up with is a 9-pointed star, which we could say is the Enneagram. And 9 has been a number that signifies this liminal space, this transition between what we might call the finite and the infinite, between the world of human consciousness and spiritual consciousness. And the number 9, of course, is found in a lot of religious systems around the world. And I've indicated a couple here. 9 Egyptian deities, 9 Greek muses, 9 Norse worlds, 9 Celtic maidens, 9 Mayan levels of the cosmos. Who knew? So if we take that 9-pointed star, now we're looking at slide 7. And the first time we see this actually being used, or let's say published, if you will, it was in about 1305. And a Franciscan friar named Ramon Lull, who was a scholar who wanted to open up a dialogue with the Jews and the Muslims. He was a Christian, a Franciscan, and he was trying to get to a rational discourse with people around the Mediterranean. He was in Majorca, I believe, to try to get to some of the common truths shared by all 3 of the great Mediterranean religions. And so he used this Enneagon or Enneagram diagram to organize what was called the 9 dignities of God, the way that the divine spirit shows up in the world. And so in this way, he was the first to really bring the Enneagram symbol to us. It's not quite what we use today, but it is an Enneagram. There's an Enneagram in there, although there's a lot of other lines in there too. But with his 9 sections, 9 territories, he talked about the 9 virtues or the 9 holy ideas, the higher states of human experience, and also talked about the 9 passions or the lower states. The 9 passions have a long history in the Christian tradition, going all the way back to a guy named Evagrius. It was one of the early monastics in Egypt, Christian monastics in the 4th century of the Christian era. And Evagrius talked about 8 states or passions, which later became the 7 deadly sins of the Christian tradition. So it went from Evagrius had 8, that changed into 7, And then with lull, we get back to this idea that there are nine passions or lower emotional states that have some correspondence to the seven deadly sins plus two. Anyway, this is the first Enneagram found in the Western world. So it shows up again a couple of centuries later. A guy named Kircher, who was also a scholar, a Jesuit, what you might call a Christian Kabbalist, certainly knew many of the old Gnostic traditions. Had an Enneagram diagram on the front of his book, the Arithmologia. And I have not read this, don't know a lot about Kircher's work, but according to Kircher, the Ennead, or the Enneagram, has something to do with the angelic worlds, and it demonstrates the hierarchy of the heavenly order. So it's like the ray of creation comes from the divine and comes down to inform our world. And, this was not something that was easily accepted by the Catholic Church at the time. But there was room for Lull and also Kircher to talk about these kind of things, as long as they didn't go too far into a Gnostic, program. So anyway, so these are early Enneagrams. And then in 1914, 1915, a guy named George Ivanovich Gurdjieff shows up in Moscow, right before the Russian Revolution.
And we're on slide 9 now?
Let's see. We're on slide 9. Thank you. So we're going from slide 8, which is the Enneagram found in Kircher's book in the 1600s. And then we are jumping ahead to 1915, Moscow 1915, where a teacher of human development, teacher of dance, music, named George Gurdjieff, shows up in Moscow and starts putting flyers on telephone poles, or whatever they had at that time, advertising something called the Dance of the Magicians, a show that he was putting on. And on this flyer, there was an Enneagram symbol. There's a lot to say about Gurdjieff. I'm not going to go too far into that today. Probably many of your listeners have heard the name or know something about Gurdjieff. He's a pretty well-known, we'd say, seminal teacher for people who've been interested in spiritual development and human development in the 20th century. As a young man, he spent several decades looking around different countries, from everywhere from Egypt to the Middle East to Nepal and Afghanistan, looking for wisdom, lost wisdom. And he apparently connected with a number of spiritual groups. He doesn't always say who and where. But he did come back after 20, 30 years, having acquired a lot of knowledge and a lot of practice from on his travels. And he established a program in Moscow. Of course, this was right before the revolution. So I'm going to jump now to slide number 10. And I wanted to mention some of the basic ideas that Gurdjieff brought in his system of human development, because they affect our work with the Enneagram system of personality types. And I like to say there are three that I'm aware of. There are a lot of ideas that he had, but there are three major ideas. One is that human beings are asleep to what's real, and that our work, our inner development, is to wake up, to be able to develop self-awareness, to think for ourselves, to come out of the trance, and to really be self-motivated and self-aware human beings. Not unique to Gurdjieff, of course, but that was central to his teaching. He also talked about, this is the second point, that people have an inner essence that's not the same as personality. People have these two parts, right? That there's a core inner self that we're born with, which can be developed, but that often gets covered up by our personality, the part of us that's adapted to our social environment. Not that personality is bad, but in the Western world, personality tends to take over, and we lose contact with who we really are in our deepest selves. And the third idea that he brought, which was very perhaps radical for his time, but not so much now, 100 years later, is that people are what he called three-brained beings, that they have three centers of intelligence, a mental center, an emotional center, and a body or instinctual center. And certainly when I was a young holistic counselor, one of the things that I liked about hearing about the Gurdjieff work was this, that they too had this concept of human beings having these three centers of intelligence. Okay, so I would say that in terms of how the Enneagram is related to the trivium, which is, again, I'm not an expert on this. You perhaps, well, certainly know more than I do about it. But I would say that in terms of the three elements, starting with the element of grammar, that the Enneagram brings us a particular language. There's a whole set of words that describe people and their character structure and their psychic process. So that's one of the things we say is that, well, there's a language here that we can use, actually that translates into every country that we've been in the world. There's a common language to this system. In terms of the second part of the trivium, the logic, this is clearly a system that is based on self-awareness. It's about reflecting and analyzing our experience, understanding our patterns, our thought patterns, our emotional patterns, being able to look at those in a way that we're not completely identified, completely caught up in them. If you're not interested in self-awareness, the Enneagram system is not going to appeal to you. It's in that category of psychology. In terms of the third aspect of the trivium, rhetoric, there's a lot of being out there in the world talking to people. We put it into work both in our personal relationships. We teach it professionally as a system of personal growth. We take it to organizations, businesses, religious congregations, and to put it into action through the communication of its value.
How is the Enneagram related to the quadrivium?
Right. This is a little harder for me to answer. What I would say is that the Enneagram really demonstrates a particular geometry. It's a set of mathematical relationships, and it's useful for charting things in the world. And even before it was used for talking about personality types, it was used for charting a number of processes, which we will get into in a few minutes. The use of the Enneagram in terms of the relationships between the different numbers and how that's useful for us. The Gurdjieff folks also related to the Western musical scale and to the movement of the planets. That's much harder for me to explain because I'm, more coming from the territory of psychology.
Sure, and if people want to understand that more, they can get a copy of John Martineau's Quadrivium book, wherein Jason Martineau and everybody explain these relationships.
Right. Yeah, there's also a lot of great books out on the Gurdjieff work. People like Uspensky and John Bennett who talk about the Enneagram and the processes of the Enneagram maps. So if we look at slide number 11, we're seeing what a representation of what Gurdjieff called his fourth way approach to human development. And it's based on these three centers. Again, this is not unique to the Gurdjieff work, but it was pretty important and still is. The idea that we can work with all three centers at the same time. That traditionally in spiritual groups, also to some degree in psychological groups, we see people using or focusing more on one of the centers. The people who work with the intellectual center primarily, Gurdjieff called this the yogi, not because of the physical yoga, but it's like the path of meditation. It's the use of the mind. And whereas people who came to development based on the emotional center, Gurdjieff would say the way of the monk, the path of the monk, the path of devotion. And we can see that reflected today in certain approaches in modern culture. And then there's the body center, the instinctual center. Gurdjieff called this traditionally the way of the fakir, the path of physical practice. We see that reflected today in all kinds of athletic disciplines, for example. Dance is another example of that. So what Gurdjieff was saying is that why not work with all three centers at the same time? And so this is, again, one of the important ideas that he had that informs our Enneagram work. Okay, so if we look at slide number 12, here we can see the change between the earlier Enneagram symbol and the new symbol that Gurdjieff brought to the West. Something happened here. The lines on the inside connected differently. And this was according to what Gurdjieff called the law of three and the law of seven. And I'll go on to say something about those. Slide number 12, we can see the law of three. And again, we don't need the Enneagram to understand this. This is to some degree common knowledge. The law of three says there are three forces that are necessary for creating an outcome. We begin with initiating force. On the Enneagram, that would be at point 3. We encounter resistance or obstacles.
Now, are we on slide 12 or 13?
Slide 13, law of three. So basically, we need all three forces. And, one way to talk about this is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Gurdjieff talked about it in terms of wholly affirming, wholly denying, and wholly reconciling. But most of us understand that when we take an action, we initiate something, it doesn't just go forward. There's resistance. There's resistance in the world around us. There's often resistance in ourselves. And we have to create a good conversation or a good dialectic between the kind of the yes energy and the no energy. And if we can hold the tension of those two forces, something develops, something rich, something deeper develops, and we get a result where the presence of a third force, a reconciling force, comes. So this is the basis of what Gurdjieff called the law of three. Slide number 14, this is the other internal diagram on the Enneagram, described as the law of seven. If we take unity, or the number 1, and we divide by 7, we get a repeating decimal of 0.142857, 142,857, and so on. And so there's some interesting math involved here around these numbers. For our purposes, we can say simply that the law of seven has to do with the succession of events. It's the steps of every process. And it's the steps not only in a linear way, like 1, 2, 3, 4, around the circumference of the Enneagram, but this diagram here, the law of seven, shows us how these steps are interrelated. That there's a relationship here between, let's say, point 1 and point 4. If we look at slide 15, we can see this chart called making a meal. And making the point that, let's say, we can work our way around the circumference of the Enneagram. We start at 9 with life. That's the kind of the end, and the beginning and the end point. At the point 1, the kitchen is ready for work. At point 2, the kitchen is at work. 3 is raw food. 4 is preparing the food, and so on. The point being that we need to look ahead. If we're going to have an organized process, it makes sense that, and we do this anyway, but here's a way to actually organize this and chart it to some degree. That we can actually look ahead to a step that comes further down the road and make sure that we're on the right track. I used an example here of making a meal. There are actually people who are working with large organizations you use this for their organizational chart, so to speak, around manufacturing processes or organizing a division of a company. But that gets a little bit complicated for our conversation today.
Let me ask you how the Enneagram evolved from Gurdjieff to Oscar Ichazo and Claudio Naranjo.
All right, great. Let's look at slide 16, because that is from a colleague of mine, Ginger Lapid-Bogda, and kind of shows something about the history of the Enneagram. Oscar Ichazo was also a teacher of human development in South America in the late 60s. And he had some exposure to the Gurdjieff work in South America. And he's the one that the Gurdjieff didn't talk about 9 personality types. I mean, he used the Enneagram as a centerpiece of his program for human development, but he didn't talk about 9 personality types. The Gurdjieff folks, they would organize other information around the Enneagram. Colors, the day of the week, the process of making a meal, the process of organizing a group for self-development purposes, and so on. Ichazo had the brilliant insight that the categories of human experience could be also organized and systematized by this Enneagram diagram. And so he came up with this basic matrix. And we still use much of his, again, his early, we've changed a lot of his descriptions and language, but his outline of the 9 types and some of the higher qualities and lower qualities are really key to our working with the Enneagram of personality types. Now, it was Claudio Naranjo that put it together with modern psychology. And Claudio brought it back to Berkeley in the 1970s and started teaching it. And from Berkeley in the 1970s, it went in a number of different directions. One place it went was to Loyola University in Chicago, where a number of Jesuits there began working with the Enneagram of personality, began teaching it, and it quickly spread to a lot of places in the Catholic world, especially seminaries and places where religious orders were living and working together and needed to really get practical about their spiritual ideas and beliefs, to kind of put them into practice with one another. So it actually has quite a development in the Catholic world, although that has recently been very much slowed down by the current Pope. Anyway, in Berkeley, we didn't understand this. We didn't know about this until we had our first international conference at Stanford University in 1994. And all of a sudden, people showed up from all places around the world saying, oh, yes, I learned it from Brother so-and-so, or someone from Japan, or from the Philippines, or from Ireland, who had learned it in a Catholic context. In any event, from Claudio Naranjo, it went to his colleague, Kathleen Spieth, who also had strong connections to the Gurdjieff work, Helen Palmer. And in Berkeley, during the late 1970s, we had a number of classes happening with what we call Enneagram panels. This was the beginning of what's called the narrative tradition of the Enneagram, where we actually learn about the types by having a panel of people who are the same type talk about their own experience. So we develop our understanding of the 9 type structures by actually listening to people who know something about this and can tell us, what is this like for them. And it's just a great way to learn about the Enneagram. That's how I was first exposed to it, was at a series of panel classes, and I thought it was all well and good. It was an interesting way to learn about psychology, and then it came to my night. And all of a sudden I felt, I was quite impressed to hear people talking about a certain point of view, a certain way of being in the world that was so similar to my own. And that made quite an impact on me. So, but at this point, there are teachers in many, many different countries. There are a couple of different training programs for Enneagram teachers, and it's still, developing as a tool in different territories: psychology, religion, business and education.
How does the Enneagram deal with passions and virtues?
Well, let's look at the next slide. That would be number 17. So here's a chart of the passions and virtues. And these are the aspects of the emotional center, the heart center. The passions, as I mentioned earlier, are the 7 deadly sins of the Christian tradition, 7 plus 2. The words are a little bit archaic. We would expand on them today, but use a little more psychological language. But here we can see around this chart the 9 different points. Each of them has a passion or an emotional habit, place we can get stuck in our feelings. And it also has the counterpart, which is what's called the virtue, or the higher aspect of the emotional center. What's potential in us?
And what about the 9 mudras? Slide number 18.
Slide number 18. Yeah, I just put this in here because it's fun. These are traditional meditative positions. The positions of the hands are different in each case, and they're meant to evoke the higher qualities, particularly the virtues or the higher emotional qualities. And they're fun to practice. It's not exactly a psychological method, but it's just a fun way to explore.
Now, how do we go from all of these various points in the Enneagram to applying it to one's own specific personality traits or the like?
Well, what's great about the Enneagram is that if you understand your type, if you know your Enneagram personality type, then that maybe takes some work. It's not always easy, but once you know that, you have access to a lot of information about your way of seeing the world, your habit of emotion, your behavioral patterns, and you can understand that the way that you think, feel, and behave, your patterns are different from the next person's. Now, many of us understand this. I mean, if we've ever been in a long-term intimate relationship, we have the opportunity to be surprised constantly by someone who sees things so differently than we do. What the Enneagram brings us is an ability to understand, okay, so we see the world this way. This is our point of view. And the person next to us sees the world a different way, with a whole different point of view that's actually equally valid. They all work. They also all have their blind spots. And so part of what the Enneagram brings us is feedback around what we're good at seeing, and what we're good at doing, and how we can, use ourselves well. But it's also about what we don't see. So what are our blind spots? And so we can start to develop a better 360 degrees, so to speak, of seeing the world as it actually is, rather than having our perception narrowed to a certain aspect of reality. So it's really good for people who are interested in self-development, whether that's in a personal sense or professional sense. And if you want to be more successful at work, the Enneagram will help you. If you want to be more successful...
Can you give us a practical application of how one would go about comparing themselves to the Enneagram?
In terms of discovering one's type?
Yes.
Yeah, well, on the internet now, there's a lot of questionnaires and tests that you can take that will tell you what your Enneagram type is. The problem is they don't all work so well. They're good for about 70%, 80% maybe, but it doesn't work for everybody. What we say about the Enneagram types is that it's actually not always determined by a person's external behavior, or how they look, or how they walk, or how they dress. It's really our internal orientation. It's our internal motivation, how we're put together on the inside. And so that might not be always easily seen from the outside, or not always easily diagnosed by a questionnaire. So what we say is it's the process of exploration. You learn something about the 9 types For some people, it jumps out at them right away. They can look at a list of 9 and say, oh, that's me. For example, point 1 is the perfectionist, right? And oftentimes they just look at the Enneagram and they go, oh, yeah, that's me. Now, many of us may have perfectionistic qualities, but type 1 on the Enneagram, who we call the perfectionist, they really, that's where they live. Getting things right all the time and having to get things right, having to make things perfect. So for some people, it comes very quickly, and others, they say, well, I could be this type or that type, and I don't know which. I'm either this one or that one. And we say, well, it's okay because it's a process of exploration, and in the exploration, you're going to learn things about yourself. So, what we say is, well, take a questionnaire, but if you can learn more, read a book, visit a couple of websites, do some self-reflection, you're more likely to connect with your Enneagram personality type.
And what are the territories of consciousness?
Okay, if we look at slide 19, I'm diverting a little bit from personality types here, just because I think it's interesting to look at, before personality types, we have a map of territories of consciousness, of human consciousness. These numbers represent something. Again, 9ness. There's something about the number 9 that is just a great organizing framework. And here we're looking at a chart that talks about these different spaces, the spaces between the numbers. And yeah, they really show up in personality types. But before even we talk about personality types, there's something about these territories of consciousness that can be arranged on the Enneagram, and with both the higher aspect and the lower aspect, and that's what you're seeing here on the chart. The top line is the positive aspect, and the bottom line is underneath the line is the corresponding difficulty. So this leads us now into 9 personality types. So if we go to slide 20, now we're looking at the 9 personality types. And there are different names for these. People use different names. These are the ones we use in the narrative tradition Enneagram school. I think they're good. But there are a lot of different names that try to capture the quality of the type. It's hard to fit it into one word or 2 words, but nonetheless, we think these names work pretty well. So here's the chart of the 9 types and the lines connecting them. Now, if we could move on to the next slide, which is number 21. Again, we're taking a look at the 3 centers again. And this is how the type structures are organized. This is for all of us. All of us have these 3 centers. Our intellectual center, we've got a higher aspect, we've got a lower aspect. The lower aspect is the fixation, meaning it's where we get stuck in our thinking. In the emotional center, similarly, there's a higher aspect and a lower aspect. The passion, we could use another phrase, it's our emotional habit. It's where we get stuck emotionally. And in the body center, we have these 3 primary instincts. And there's more to say about that at another time. So if we look at slide 22, we'd say that as we begin to approach describing the 9 personality types, it's useful to talk about 3 different groups. Right? All of us have 3 centers of intelligence, but one of those centers is highlighted for us. It's more familiar. It's our home base. Whether we're aware of it or not, it's how our personality structure is formed. It has a lot to do with the particular center, which is most, let's say, our lead center. And so shorthand here is to say, well, we've got body types, feeling types, and thinking types. And there's 3 very important variations within these groups. Right? So we got 9 personality types. But we can start by saying, okay, there's these 3 centers. We all have all three centers, but one of those centers determines our particular way of being in the world. And this will become a little clearer as we go through the 9 personality types, because we'll say, okay, well, these guys are the body types, and these guys are the feeling types, and what does that mean? What's the difference between a body type, a feeling type, and a thinking type? And there are very considerable differences.
I was just going to ask you about the center-related issues.
That's slide number 23. Maybe a little complicated without knowing the 9 types, but I think it's interesting to look at the lower right diagram. That's like the key, meaning that the first 3 triangles have to do with the issues that are related to these different groups. Meaning, if you were the major emotional themes, let's say, the body types, types 8, 9, and 1 on the Enneagram are what we call body-based types. But the major emotional issue is anger. And whereas for the feeling types, the major emotional issue is grief. 2, 3, and 4. And it shows up differently in the personality, but on the inside, grief is really a major issue for the feeling types, and fear for the mental types. And again, we'll look at the variations of this in terms of 9 distinct types, but this is an interesting way to begin. And similarly with these other diagrams, there are major issues that are different for the body types. At the top, we say fairness and justice, different versions of that, but things are supposed to be a certain way, and they're not the way they should be, and by God, we want to make them different. That's the fair thing. That's the right thing. Whereas on the 3-point, 2s, 3s, and 4s, representing, the feeling types over on the right side, we say issues of identity are important because 2s, 3s, and 4s are also what we call image types. Feeling types are also image types, meaning that the feeling types are really responsive to other people's expectations. And they form their identity based on getting the approval and recognition of other people. And so they create an image.
Sort of a provisional self-esteem.
Yeah. I mean, we could say it's also, something we all do to some degree. But for many of us, earning other people's recognition and approval is not such a big deal. Whereas for points 2, 3, and 4, their identity is a lot about that. Can they establish a constant identity, or are they constantly looking for, self-validation from external sources? And for the mental types, 5, 6, and 7, over on the left side of the triangle there, we could say security issues are important. So similarly, archetypal issues, body types, we say it's about being asleep or waking up. Now, that's part of the human condition, but for body types, we're really good at kind of, checking out. And we need to work very hard at staying present.
So now how do you figure out exactly on these other 3 triangles, the larger ones, how the smaller key applies?
The smaller key is just means that the top of the triangle represents the body types, 8, 9, and 1. The right side of the triangle represents the feeling types, 2, 3, and 4. And the left side of the triangle is the thinking types, mental types, 5, 6, and 7. These are related to the centers. The body center on the top, feeling center on the right, and the mental center on the left.
Let's begin with the 9 types discussion. How would you describe the 9 personality types?
Slide 24, the attentional styles. We'll come back to this as we go through the 9 types. The point being that each of the 9 types has a particular habit of attention. There are certain things that really draw our attention. And we'll talk about each of these as we go through the 9 types. So let's start with the slide 25. Here we have a just a brief outline of what we call the perfectionist type 1. Ones are a body-based type. They really want to get things right. There's this tremendous emphasis on being a good person, on doing the right thing. Not that the rest of us don't want to do that at times, but for this type, for type 1, they really want to be good. They're responsible, they're honest, improvement-oriented. At the same time, they put a lot of pressure on themselves. There's a very severe inner critic that can judge them quite harshly. So the basic quality of critical thinking has to be managed. If critical thinking gets out of hand or becomes overly aggressive, they will be really, really hard on themselves. They can also be quite judgmental towards others. And so the problem side of this type is that they can be resentful because they're working so hard, and why isn't everybody else working as hard as they are? They can be overly critical, and also they can be non-adaptable because, for them, they tend to see things in terms of one right way. There's a right way to do everything. And the job is to find that one right way, and by God, you do things right. We can also see on the slide the lower emotion is anger, although, people are not always in touch with their lower emotion. Ones don't usually know they're angry. We know they're angry, but they don't know they're angry. Sometimes they do with some inner work. Higher emotion is serenity. And then we have what's called the idealization and the avoidance. The idealization is something we want to live up to and think we should live up to. And it's a positive thing, but when it gets put in this place we call the idealization, then it becomes a trap. And so for once, the idealization is I'm right. And it's really not okay for them to be wrong, because that really sets off the inner critic. And so their avoidance is making mistakes or being incorrect. And this puts a lot of pressure on them on the inside. This is a tough place. Again, I'm trying to present these in terms of both the positive aspects and also the challenging aspects. And I put on some examples of public figures. The caveat being that we don't know 100%. This is our best guess. I've garnered support from others who know the Enneagram about this, but it's really hard to know exactly what a public figure is. But we can at least observe and have some idea about the likely Enneagram type. And if you look over these examples of public figures, you may be able to get some of the flavor of people really trying to do the right thing. Okay, we ready for type 2?
Absolutely.
This is slide number 26. And type 2, we're now in the area of the feeling types. And we're going around the right side of the Enneagram. And we've left the body types. We'll come back later. But we're in the area of the feeling types. And this is very clear with type 2. They are really a feeling type. And you may recognize some of these folks in your life. We say the giver, the helper, the supporter. They have this tremendous empathy. They're able to feel what other people feel and what other people need really easily and really strongly. Oftentimes before we know ourselves what we're feeling, they know what we're feeling. The problem is that they can overdo this, and they can be feeling everybody else's feelings and not feeling their own feelings. So, but it's really connecting through the emotional center. The attention goes out to other people to help people, both in terms of their just basic good nature and also for the purpose of getting other people's approval and recognition. And they're very good at adapting themselves. Now, you can see the difference between type 1, which we just talked about, and type 2. Type 1 is actually pretty non-adaptable because they're trying to get it right. Type 2 is very adaptable. And again, they make great communicators. They're really great in relationship up to a point. But when they over-adapt, they can lose contact with who they are. So this is the gift of the feeling type, but also the difficulty of the feeling type. Their image is, I'm a good person because I'm kind and I'm helpful, and that is often true, but there's also other things going on underneath the surface that they may not be aware of themselves. Their lower emotion, you can see on the slide, it's pride, meaning either inflated or deflated. It's not just aggrandized. Sometimes it's being overly modest. And the higher emotion is humility. It's like just being able to have self-esteem for oneself. It's not completely dependent on other people's approval. The idealization is I am helpful, which is true, but can be a trap. And the avoidance is that they, twos, have a really hard time communicating their own needs. And then we have some examples of public figures here. So, okay, we'll go on to the next slide, which is type 3. This is slide number 27. Now, 3 are called the performer. Now, they're a feeling type, but they don't necessarily look like it because they're taking all their emotional energy and they're using it to feel out what's expected of them in order to be successful. So it's in some ways it's close to 2, and in other ways quite different. They can be good in relationship or not so good in relationship, but their number one priority is being successful, being productive and successful. These are they're not only the high achievers of the Enneagram. I mean, any type can be a high achiever, but these folks are constantly on the go. They go, 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 go. They're like the Energizer bunnies on the Enneagram, and they have a very hard time slowing down. This has typically been the culture in American business, not because everybody's a type 3, but because 3s are often the managers and the leaders, and sometimes the CEOs, and you know, their culture is, hey, we can all be successful here by hard work and perseverance, and which is often true, but not always. Their lower emotional habit, we say, is vanity. It's like they're perhaps putting up too much of an image. It's like they're believing in their image. You know, I have to be seen as being a successful person. And their higher emotion is truthfulness, which is about coming home to themselves. It's like, well, you know, there's a real person in here with my own feelings, my own needs, and I can be successful, but I don't have to be trapped in constantly running on the treadmill. Their avoidance is failure. It's like we say, for 1, making mistakes is the awful thing. For type 3, failure is the really awful thing. But of course, sometimes there's failure in life, and failures can be very important to acknowledge and learn from. So here's some possible examples of public figures. Again, we can't say 100% that they're all type 3s, but probably most likely 3s. And you may get a particular flavor from this group. Scott McNeely, by the way, who's first on the list, is the head of CEO of Sun Microsystems, big computer company out here in California. Okay, so we'll move on to type 4, which is slide number 28.
The romantic.
The romantic. Again, now we see a feeling type with a lot of feelings, right? 3s, they kind of put their feelings aside, but 4s, oh, they got a lot of feelings. Now, particularly visible in women. Sometimes the guys hide out a little bit. Sometimes the guys who are 4s, at least in the United States, are a little bit in the closet. But in Latin culture, there's more room, even for the guys to be feelingful types. And these, so many of the great artists who've channeled the feeling tones of music and dance and poetry have been type 4s. And you can see from the list at the bottom. I mean, there's just a long, long list. Artists can be of any Enneagram type, but there's something about the romantic, the poet, the dancer, the singer-songwriter, and so on, shows up here in big numbers. They experience a sense of longing for what's missing. It leads them to a place of melancholy. And melancholy is not always a bad thing. Fours really value their emotional experience. Even if it's sad, they're okay with that. What we say the best part of fours is that they have access to this full range of human emotion, from the deepest sorrow to the greatest joys. And they can take the rest of us there if we're willing to go. Because they know how to, they're no strangers to very intense emotional experience. They want to be personally connected to everything they do, whether it's work or relationships. They are also, like the other feeling types, they want to be recognized and approved of by other people. At the same time, they're individualists at heart. So there's this tension for fours. Like, yeah, I want other people's approval, but I have to be my own person. So there's this kind of push-pull around that. Twos and threes, the other feeling types, attention goes out to other people or to tasks. For fours, attention tends to come in. It's not that they can't be hard workers or good at relationship, but more than the other feeling types, attention comes in to the inside. What am I experiencing? What am I feeling? And to be able to value and spend time in the inner landscape. So we say their strengths, they're compassionate, they're idealistic, there's emotional depth. But the problem side is that they can be moody, uncooperative, and withdrawn. Because the feelings can rise and fall in a short period of time. Their idealization is, I'm authentic. They hate being ordinary. And yet this is a problem for them, because if you have to always be authentic, that can also put a lot of pressure on them. And if they fail to have the truly authentic romantic experience, then maybe life is not so good, or they're not so good, or the relationship is not so good. So it's easy for them to become quite disappointed because they are such romantic idealists. Ring any bells, Jan? You probably know people like this.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm looking at the next slide right now, which is number 29, number 5, the observer.
Yeah. Well, we're moving around the bottom of the Enneagram, and we're actually crossing over a space there, which we call the space of interiority. And fours and fives both really value their interior landscape. But fives do so from the standpoint of being a mental type. It's not that fives can't have feelings, but their minds are so strong that, when they're being defended, it's really easy for them to kind of hole up in their minds. They can actually get away from their feelings, or even get away from their bodies, and really hole up in their minds, because that's a place that's very rich and safe for them. Their primary goal is to acquire knowledge and expertise. Sometimes they'll share that with the rest of us, sometimes not. It's like knowledge for its own sake. There's such a history here of scholars and scientists and spiritual seekers. They're also, they need a lot of time alone. They have very sensitive nervous systems. Each of these types has a particular neurobiology, you might say. And these folks, the fives, are very sensitive in their nervous system, so they can be easily overwhelmed by too much stimulation. Sometimes just the presence of other people for too long can be too much. So they need to kind of go away and kind of recreate themselves in their own space. Of course, we want them to come back and participate too. So that's where they need to kind of work with themselves. How much is going away to their own private space, genuine and good, and recreating them, or how much of it is a place just to kind of hide out and avoid everybody. As we say, the problem side could be that they can become isolated if they're not careful. And again, I won't say everything that's on this slide, but they have an idealization of being knowledgeable. Their avoidance is the experience of inner emptiness. And we have some examples of public figures here.
All right, so what about number 6, the loyal skeptic?
Okay, this is a confusing one because there is a lot of different kinds of external behavior here. Sixes are mental types, and they're looking for security either in relationships with people or in their ideas and plans. This is the type we call the doubting mind. And they can doubt things, they can question things. Why is this so? In this way, they can really develop things to a deeper level. At the same time, too much doubting, too much questioning can be a problem for them and also for the people around them. Some of them, now keep in mind that the emotional habit here is fear. And this is a part of the human condition. We all have fear at times. But sixes, because of their neurobiology, we'd say that their fight, flight, or freeze system is most easily triggered. They're the ones that watch out for danger. They see things coming. They're good at anticipating problems, coming up with solutions, protecting the group, the family, the community from potential danger.
Well, you know, some of those names you have down there at the bottom, like George W. Bush and Newt Gingrich, I think and Pat Robertson for that matter, were better at creating the problems that they were there to warn you about, you know.
Well, see, this is what happens is that if you become aggressive, if you kind of rush forward to what we call a counterphobic position, you can take a very aggressive stance. That you can kind of brace yourself and rush into action, and that's not always well considered action. You know, so you can have a political position or an ideological position that's very strong, but doesn't allow for much disagreement. Other sixes, you know, like we use the example of Woody Allen, you know, are more on the cautious or hesitant side. They're kind of like actively worried and anxious. And so, you know, how could one personality type include Woody Allen and Mel Gibson? Well, this is why we say, on the one hand, you know, they can react to the emotional habit of fear by holding back, by being cautious and anxious, or they can react by adopting a position of strength and assertiveness, or both. Actually, most sixes can know both places at different times. On the one hand, they're very loyal, you know, they'll hang in there. They're not afraid of dealing with trouble or problems. In fact, they kind of like that. You know, let's get things out on the table. On the other hand, they're skeptical. It's like, well, why are you talking about this Enneagram stuff? What's the point of that? You know, or why did you do this when you walked in the room yesterday? Why would, you know, and so there's this kind of questioning and challenging that can sometimes be difficult for people that they're in relationship with. So anyway, so sixes are not easy to type based on their external behavior. If we go on to type 7, which is slide number 31, we call it the epicure or the positive planner. And here we've got the positive outlook on life. Sixes tend to be skeptical, you know, doubtful on that side of things, looking for problems. Sevens are looking for fun, you know. They're looking for all the fun activities and possibilities, and the more the better. The downside for sevens is they might not see the problem side of something, or they might be unwilling to see the problem side of something. So, you know, sixes look at the seven sometimes and going, you know, hey, you're not, you know, we're going to run out of resources here. We're going to run out of money in our budget. And the sevens are saying, oh, no, it's okay. Don't worry. It'll all be great. So there can be a lot of arguments there between two personality types that are actually pretty close together on the Enneagram, but have a very different point of view. The idealization for sevens is I'm positive. And, of course, we really appreciate the sevens for their positive energy. I don't know how it is for you, Jan, but here in Northern California, this is kind of the seven capital of the world. There's a lot of,
Well, what's funny is,
think positively.
yeah, well, last year I had Dr. Barbara Ehrenreich on my show, who wrote the book Bright Sided.
Yeah, yeah, right.
It's a very good book, and she brings a lot of key issues to the surface regarding, positivism and just, its
Yeah,
effects.
yeah, the
Like, for
dangers of that,
instance,
right,
there are serious dangers from it. Like, for instance, that book and DVD, The Secret.
right. I'm not a big fan of The Secret.
Yeah, well, it's based in Kantian philosophy, and it's just whatever you think you can go out and create. So all these people went in and bought homes and jewelry and things that they couldn't afford, and now we're paying for a lot of that irresponsibility.
Right. Yeah. I think the point here that the Enneagram makes is that we're looking for some kind of balance, that we need to know kind of where we're overloaded in our point of view
Right.
and,
Well,
and where our blind spots are.
the lower emotion there is gluttony, so that does fit right in with something like The Secret.
Yeah. And it's not just gluttony about food or drinking. It's gluttony for like more. Like, if something is good, let's have more. Let's have more of this and more of this. And sevens need to, sometimes they have to kind of slow down and go a little deeper into the experience. It's like, be here now is good advice for sevens because their
Right.
minds are so quick. They just so quickly go into the future and come up with new ideas and new possibilities and new plans. And they're very creative in that way. But again, it can be unbalanced.
Now, what about, say, someone changing their number, or someone who has, aspects from all of these things? Wouldn't most people have aspects from all of the 9 different types?
Well, yeah, we should talk about that. Maybe, at the end of the 9 types, we can look at how people move around on the Enneagram, because the Enneagram suggests that we have certain affinities.
All right, so let's see. We're on number 8 of the 9 types. Is that correct?
Yeah, let's finish out these types here. So number 8 is slide 32. This is the protector. Now we are coming back around the circumference of the Enneagram, and we're in the area of the body types. Right? 7 was a mental type. 8 is a body-based type. And this is pretty clear with 8s. 8s kind of come from their gut. They have a good gut sense of knowing. 8s have pretty big personalities generally. Sometimes they can be quiet or introverted, but they've got like big energy because they're in contact with their body energy. They like it. They like to put it into action. They like to get things done. They like to take charge. They like to be in charge of their space. And we say the leader, any type can be a leader, but 8s often will take leadership just because they naturally want to, get things done and get the energy moving. 8s are very big on fairness and justice. They'll protect people who are under their care. They're not afraid of conflict. It's not that 8s seek out conflict necessarily, but conflict is a part of life. 8s will fight hard for what they want or what they believe in. And that can be a very high goal in the service of many people, or it can be a very self-centered goal, like I want what I want and you're in my way. We say strengths, they're enthusiastic, they're generous, powerful. The problem is that their big energy can also be experienced by other people as dominating. A big issue for 8s is excess. It's like too much. It's a little different from gluttony of the 7, which more stems from the mind, although it can certainly lead 7s into over-consuming. But 8s just like a lot. This enthusiasm for life can become excessive. Like too much work, too much play, too much eating, too much drinking, just the too muchness, which 8s tend to go for. Anger is an issue here. It's an issue for all the body types, but particularly for 8s. Easy to get angry. Easy to let go of anger, too. But again, this can be a problem for people they're in relationship with. The idealization is I'm a strong person, and there's something very admirable about the strength of the eights, but it can be really a trap because it can keep the eights away from any kind of vulnerability unless they do some personal work on themselves and learn to tolerate that, there's some vulnerability there too. And sometimes we get our feelings hurt. So last type number 9, which is slide number 33. Now, 9s are the mediators. They sit at the top of the Enneagram, and they somehow include all the other types. 9s are really good at seeing everybody else's point of view. Oftentimes when 9s look at the Enneagram, they say, well, I'm like all of these folks. Oftentimes that's a clue. They're mediators. They're good at mediating conflict. Their main goal in life is harmony. Harmony can either be at a high level, bringing everybody together in terms of developing a peaceful community, a community that works, a family that's thriving, or it can be kind of low-level harmony where I just want to be comfortable and don't bother me. So 9s can get into a place of like, I'm sitting in my chair, I've got my TV on, I don't want to be bothered. So again, there's the high side and the low side. 9s can be very accepting, welcoming of people. We say they're the glue of the human community. There are probably more 9s on this planet than any other type. They can be good at kind of attuning to the rhythms of daily life, the rhythms of the planet, because they're body-based types, and they can blend. Well, they can blend with other people, and they can blend with their environment, which is a lovely quality. But again, sometimes if they don't take care, they can lose track of themselves. They can lose track of their own priorities by just kind of going with the flow. So, and they avoid conflict. And, sometimes conflict is necessary, whether it's conflict with another person where you have to kind of take your stand and say what you have to say. Sometimes conflict is on the inside where there's some inner conflict. I want to do this, I don't want to do this. And 9s really have their work cut out to stay with that conflict, to stay aware, stay present, and not just put it all under the surface, because then nothing happens. Okay, so those are the nine types, and of course this is just a quick review. There's much more available to learn here. More on that in a few minutes. Shall we take a look at some of the movement on the lines?
Sure.
The Enneagram suggests, and here's where it gets a little bit mysterious again. Those lines on the inside of the Enneagram, Law of 3, Law of 7, actually have some intelligence for us as human beings. And we can't explain this scientifically. We can only say that it seems to work in the experience of many hundreds of thousands of people now involved in the Enneagram, and everybody has to find is it true in your experience? See what it means to you. When people get stressed out, certain kinds of stress, usually when we get stressed we become more fixated or more stuck in our type, but certain kinds of stress, whether it's a lot or over a long period of time or whatever, different for different people, we can move to what's called our stress point.
And this is slide number 34, correct?
Yes, thank you. Slide number 34. And these arrows here on the lines indicate the movement to the stress point. So 1 goes to 4, 4 to 2, 2 to 8, and so on. And there's a real shift in our orientation, our point of view, our attitude. We all of a sudden we find ourselves acting and reacting more like this other type. And so it can be quite a different experience. There's this psychodynamic shift that happens. Really useful for therapists and psychologists and coaches to understand this, because people show up sometimes in sessions with us and they show up in their stress point. They're there because they're really stressed out, and so they're presenting more from another Enneagram point that's not actually their home base. So that's very useful to know. It's not always a bad thing to go to the stress point. Sometimes we can go to what's called the stress point where it's also a resource point, like there's something valuable there for us. Like type 6, for example. Type 6 can move over to 3. Well, it's good for 6s sometimes to go to 3. Instead of like kind of being hesitating, thinking, planning, doubting, they just go to 3 and they get things done. They just go into action. But they don't want to stay there too long because it's going to be stressful for them ultimately. Especially in high-powered corporate settings, a lot of the 6s get kind of pulled into 3 because that's the high-achieving culture that's modeled there, and they end up with a lot of stress. My point being that even though there's a resource, it can be stressful in the long run. So there's two ways to look at this, both a positive and a negative side. And then the next slide, which is slide number 35. This is a movement in the opposite direction on the lines, the other direction, where when we're feeling safe and secure, we tend to move to what's called the heart point or the security point. We relax our type structure, we make a shift along these lines, and now we show up in a different place. And there's something very useful about this, something very potentially productive here. So again, using the example of type 6, when 6s relax, they tend to move towards point 9, the mediator, which is a body type. Pretty good thing for 6s. They drop down from their heads down into their bellies. They relax all that scanning for problems and danger. They can be comfortable. They can be kind of blend with people or their environment. Usually a pretty good thing for a 6 to relax to their hard point at 9. And then they come back to 6. They bring some of that good body energy with them. So it's a good combination. It's not that we lose our home base or that we completely change our type, but we do move around on these lines. And we also move around a bit to the points on either side of us on the circle, what are called the wing points. So from this point of view, we have potential connections with the two types on either side, the wing points, and we also have the internal lines, heart security point, stress resource point. So actually there's these 4 other places that we might be familiar with, depending on our circumstance.
What is the importance in recognizing the limitations of generalizing, and are there certain natural affinities and natural repulsions between certain types?
Right. Yeah, 2 good questions. What we try to say in every time we speak about the Enneagram is that nobody can be reduced to a number. We are more than that. We are unique individuals. We have an essential self. But personality tends to fall into the certain patterns. The Enneagram suggests 9 patterns. Other systems, Myers-Briggs, the DISC, you can talk about 16 or 5 or so on. The Enneagram says there are 9 archetypal patterns. And we've got these personalities. And the point is to understand that we don't want to stereotype. There are highs and lows. There are the worst examples of each type. There are noble people, saints, wonderful people in all these types. So we have to try not to stereotype. Well, if you're a type this, then you're like this. Well, not necessarily. It's not talking just about behavior, but really about our type structures.
Well, couldn't this be compared in many ways to astrology?
Some people compare it, yeah.
Well, let me ask you this: what is the difference between this and astrology?
I find astrology interesting, and I every Sunday I I look at my horoscope in the Sunday paper, but I don't find astrology so useful in terms of understanding psychological structure. to me, the Enneagram is very practical. That's the reason that I've been involved with it for 33 years now. I mean, I like the ideas, I like the concepts of the Enneagram, but really, I'm still with it because it's so practical and useful, and it can be learned at different levels. Astrology to me is something very complicated, also a wonderful opportunity for the use of intuition. But I'm not so good at that. I'm more kind of nuts and bolts practical person, and so that's why I think the Enneagram, it can be used at different levels of learning. You can get into it briefly and you'll get something out of it. You can work on it more deeply to develop your self-awareness and work on your character structure. You can work on it for, your type for, many years, let's say. There's a very clear path of self-development that's delineated by the Enneagram. Astrology I find interesting, but not quite so specific or practical. Now, I'm sure there's people that use it, in practical ways, but I don't, and I find it, the learning curve is pretty steep.
All right, well, let's talk about slide number 36, applications, and what impact might understanding one's own Enneagram type have on a person?
Well, for one thing, in relationships, which is probably its most popular application, we don't have to take things so personally. We can understand that people are coming from a different place, a different point of view, and it's not all about us. We can also notice how when our patterns have taken us over, particularly our reactivity, because the Enneagram says, well, this is what you got to watch out for. And so if we know what those are, we can remember them. It's like, oh, okay, so we say to the eights, for example, we understand that you have anger come up. Don't just express that anger in a reactive way, but manage it well. Use it, harness it. Don't just go blasting away at people, because that's not going to serve you very well. So it's very specific around how we can become better in relationship, better communicators, also better decision makers, because we understand that our point of view is limited to one area of life. I see these things really well, but I don't see the same things that you see well, unless I can, self-reflect and open up my mind. So it's very practical in a lot of different areas, whether we're talking about personal growth or spiritual development or being more successful in the world. It works in all those areas. It's been particularly useful in families. People in relationships, husbands and wives, partners of different kinds, to be able to have a language to talk about the issues, to understand what's going on. What are the emotional reactions that come up? What are the patterns that get in the way? Parents and children, it's not that we can know what the types of our kids are, but if we know our own type, then we know something about our parenting style. And just to understand that the kids may be different from us and that we have to adapt in order to support them in becoming, the best that they can be in their own, according to who they are, not always, the way that we did it. So anyway, where are we? Slide 36 indicates some of the applications that have been developed in the last 10 to 20 years with the Enneagram. And as I say, it's been very interesting to be able to go to a lot of different places in the world and, to put this Enneagram system to work.
Where is the Enneagram being used today?
Well, as part of the Enneagram narrative tradition program, working with Helen Palmer and Dr. David Daniels from Stanford, we do a lot of teaching workshops in different places in the United States and other countries. And we also train Enneagram teachers from various professional fields. And so we see people from probably the three main areas that people come to our programs, particularly our teacher training program. We have people from psychology, people who are therapists, psychologists, who understand that this is a really great way to work with character structures. We also have people coming from the business community who want to be better coaches, better communicators, better leaders, want to put the Enneagram to work either directly or indirectly with their staffs, build teamwork, to reduce a lot of the conflict that just shows up because of people's, personalities and how they push everybody's buttons and so on. Sometimes people are also interested in using the Enneagram to chart out strategy. So that's the second group, business professionals. And the third group, we have people who are spiritual directors or religious advisors or religious clergy who are interested in the Enneagram as a path of spiritual development, understanding the obstacles that different people face. And in all cases, what's so useful is, to really develop on the path. What I need to work on, my issues are going to be different than yours. Unless we're the same personality type. But where I need to focus. And so what the Enneagram does is it tailors it brings a lot of the great ideas and methodology from all the great literature and ways and schools and ideas that are out there, and brings it to a more personal level so that we have a tailored plan of self-development. Like, this is what I need to focus on. These are my main issues, and it's going to be different from me than it is for the other people in the room. So anyway, at this point, I'm happy to say I get to go to other countries and and talk to other people, oftentimes through a translator because I don't speak Chinese and my French isn't that great. But, the Enneagram makes a common language. And people... Yeah.
I was going to ask you, what is the narrative tradition of the Enneagram?
This is really about hearing from people. It's the primary teaching format is the interview method. So when we're talking to somebody about their possible personality type, we interview them. We ask them questions. We have a conversation. When we're in a class or a workshop, we have panels. We have people sit in panels. Sometimes it's formal, like there's like a panel of, say, sixes in the front of the room or a panel of fives. Other times it's more informal. We're sitting in a circle. But we try to get people to talk about, so here are some of the headlines about the types. What is it like for you? Tell us about it in your experience. And so we make it a conversation. And so the narrative, I think, is a great way to learn about the Enneagram because you get to hear people's stories, how it shows up in their lives. And, the books are great. Websites and books are great. But to actually be in the room with people and hear them talking about their experience of the type really supports three-center learning. We're not just learning with our minds, we're also learning with our hearts and our bodies. So that's what the narrative tradition is about. And there are other schools of Enneagram, and many of them are very good. So I'm not saying ours is the only way to learn about the Enneagram. It's just the way we think is good.
How is the Enneagram used by organizations and religious and spiritual groups?
Organizations use it at different levels. In a one-day workshop, we might go in and teach an Enneagram workshop for an organization, for a staff, 8 people, 30 people. It gives people a sense of diversity. We could say it's a diversity training. It's like, people see things differently from the way that you do. It gives people a chance to self-reflect on their point of view. Usually we start with a particular application Most often that's communication because it's so specific and practical. It's like if you're this type, here's what you're good at and here's what you need to learn in terms of your communication. And very, very specific. It's like a short list, do this, don't do this. So even in a one-day workshop or training, there's something that people can learn in organizations. Over time, if we have more opportunity, people can use it for over a period of time to develop teams. There's all this talk about teamwork and teams nowadays because it's just a faster and more efficient way of being productive. It's where all the companies are heading or need to be heading. But to have the people's skills, we say
that almost sounds communist.
Yes. Well,
I could never understand the irony in the corporate workplace of how you always had this one guy who wanted to be in control and be the tyrant, but then he wanted everybody else underneath him to be good little communist soldiers.
Right. Well, the companies have to develop their staffs. They've got to give them more responsibility. They've got to give them more training. They've got to pay more attention to what works for them. There's so much waste from employees who are they're just not motivated. They're not happy with their jobs. It's such a waste of human power and talent. And so anyway, I think there are some values. I mean, one thing we say about the Enneagram is that it's fairly neutral in terms of ideology and neutral in terms of methodology, which is why it can be combined with so many different things. But, there are two values, I think, that are inherent. One is self-awareness, and the other is an appreciation of diversity. It's like learning to appreciate the other people who are different than you. And that alone can be such a help in an organization. So it's a way to actually give people the skills they need to be a team player, to operate in a high-performing team. Instead of just having the idea, the rhetoric, the language of that, it's like, here's a way to develop people's ability. It develops emotional intelligence. And, studies have shown now, Daniel Goleman, for example, in his books about emotional intelligence, whenever a group of people, a team, a work group, whatever you want to call it, comes together, the single most important factor for their productivity as a group is emotional intelligence. It's more important than IQ, more important than mental intelligence. And so we think the Enneagram is just a great way to develop emotional intelligence and a way of having better rapport and empathy with the people around you.
All right. What is the single most important aspect that you would like people to take away from this interview?
I think that what we have is a diagram, a system of sorts that comes to us from many centuries ago. We don't know exactly where it began. We do know a little bit about how it's showed up here in the modern world. We have the evolution of the Enneagram from a mathematical set of numbers and interrelated connections to now a very elegant system of psychological types. And it has just a really practical and useful value for people. So my hope is that at least some of the audience will be interested in learning more about the Enneagram. A little bit is okay. A lot is good. Whatever level of interest is yours. And there are many, many opportunities for that. And the last slide in the show here, slide 37, gives some suggestions if people are interested in further learning. I put on.
Yeah, and why don't you give out your website and any contact information you'd like people to have as well? And
Yeah.
it's listed there on the last slide, but you might as well give it out to everyone.
Yeah, well, if people are interested, my website can be found at enneagramwork.com. That's Ennea, E-N-N-E-A, Gram, enneagramwork.com. And the organization that I'm a part of, Enneagram Studies in the Narrative Tradition, has a big website with a lot of information. It's called enneagramworldwide.com because it reflects our connections and programs in many countries around the world. There are a lot of great Enneagram books. I'm partial to the ones by my mentors and colleagues, Helen Palmer, The Enneagram, or The Enneagram in Love and Work. And Dr. David Daniels has a little book out, a very accessible book, like, $12 from Harper. It's called The Essential Enneagram. And so that's listed on the slide, but just to say it out loud if people are interested.
All right, Peter, thank you so much for taking your time to explain us the details of the Enneagram, and I really appreciate your time coming on today.
Well, thanks, Jan, for having your website and doing the interview with me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. And, thanks for all your good work.
Thank you.